Hi, my name is Charles Alexander, and I want to welcome you to the Community of Writers. This is my first program here, though the program is something that began as Page Open with a group called Bridge Street Live in Victoria, Texas. I am a longtime Tucsonan who returned here just in the last few months, and it's absolutely marvelous to bring this program to Pima Community College. I'm here today with Tyler Meier, who is the director of the University of Arizona Poetry Center, and he's the former managing editor of the Kenyon Review, one of the most prestigious literary reviews in the nation. And welcome, Tyler.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks, Charles.
I'm interested in how you first came to poetry and what might be very different about this moment in our time and in your position as directing a literary program to whatever you may have expected when you sort of chose a life to be involved in literature.
This is a good question. So I came to poetry in high school through a great teacher and really to books. And so eyes were opened by someone named Joe Hecker, who still teaches high school English in Central Ohio, and who opened up a different world for me and really, in a way, taught me sort of how to read. Not that I was incapable of that before, but how to read in a way that I was excited about, and where the books were speaking back to me in a way that was really thrilling. So that's where it started, and I started writing, wanting to model the people I was reading, and a lot of my entry points were the ones that you might expect, the Beats and others. So fast forward to studying English and writing through college, doing some work in AmeriCorps and doing some writing, ending up here in Tucson after a time at the Kenyon Review. A lot of what I think about with the contemporary moment with poetry that's different is that the politics are wild right now, and poetry has a responsibility to the moment as much as it has to something that might feel more out of time or beyond time. And so part of our work, I think, is imagining how poets are thinking about where we are right now as individuals, where our environmental life is right now, where our country's life is right now. And so that's a lot of the work.
Where our gender lives are right now.
Where our gender lives are right now.
Very much in the news, and very much a part of poetry, I think.
Sure.
As may be evident in a program even coming up this week that you have something to do with as director of the Poetry Center.
That's right. So there's a book launch with CHAX Press, with an anthology that the press is putting out called Letters to the Future, featuring African-American writers writing in a more experimental or non-traditional
and all
way.
Women writers, right?
All women, thank you. Yeah, so all women. So it's exciting to think about elevating and celebrating those voices, making a special space, a bigger space for those writers, those thinkers, and for these conversations.
Yes.
And poetry does that exceedingly well, in ways that we're thrilled by.
I had a poet kind of say to me recently, he was a little bit upset that maybe some presses were paying too much attention in his mind to different ethnic groups, different gender groups, and giving them maybe a privilege of certain kinds. And I responded that at one time I might have had some kind of definition of what poetry was, but now I find I have to listen to all these different communities, and I want to listen to them, and my ideas are changing all the time, and which is an exciting thing to happen throughout your life. How do you feel like your ideas are changing in this moment too?
Ever expanding, right? So it's a small galaxy in my brain, and it's getting bigger. And I'm grateful for this. Poetry does this remarkably well. It's an art form that reinvents. It's not static.
Right.
It's so fluid, so interesting in the ways that it adapts and adopts and changes. And so if you're not reading, listening broadly, you're missing some of that, and that's a poverty. And I think when you realize what's available, and then the hope. Yeah. I mean, the hope that we think of at the Poetry Center, or as a publisher, you want people to explore that range, and find some space themselves for, where they find affinity, where they connect.
I think also when I relate to my own time and realize that whether tacitly, directly, tangentially, in some way, everything is political.
Sure.
And but that has also made me look back to poetry of the 15, 16, 17, and it always was.
Right.
Although when we put this thing up, which we call the history of literature, we sort of elevate it and forget that. We forget what a radical John Milton was, arguing for divorce on the grounds of incompatibility and arguing about the right to overthrow a king. And you know, poets have been involved through the ages. Tell me, back to the notion of running a poetry center. I mean,
Sure.
I have run programs, I have presented readings and conferences, but you're running arguably one of the largest, most active poetry centers in the nation.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
I'm tired. No, it's a thrill. It's such an exciting opportunity, such a gift. You know, one thing I think of poetry centers, you know, the work of being a programmer, you know, is we're best when we're humming, you know, when we're moving, and when things are happening. So it's been a real exciting opportunity for us to think about all the ways to activate the life of poetry and all the possible ways we could do that. There's everything from sort of investments in the fragile economy, the arts economy around poetry. So buying books from publishers for our library, paying poets to come and do the work of being a poet in our community, partnering with groups to support their work and being able to provide some financial support there. All of that matters and helps. So.
Yeah. And do you feel in partnership with other poetry centers around the nation at all? Can you mention some of those perhaps? Because I know students I talk to don't know sometimes that there are such things as living poets, much less poetry centers, much less what those places do. And I know you're aware of them both at other college and university settings, but also outside of college and university settings.
This has been exciting work recently. There's a bigger national conversation among poetry presenters, groups that are primarily presenting poets, and this represents a sort of national geography. So we're working with a coalition of organizations that are meeting once a year for a weekend retreat to talk about how we might work collaboratively to raise the visibility that poets should have, and the visibility of poetry in the culture. So everything from Poets House in New York, the Poetry Foundation, some of our big partners in major metropolitan areas, but San Francisco State has an amazing and important poetry center that is specific to San Francisco, but broader. It's a nationally important place.
Although I will say I read at that poetry center a year and a half ago, and I was trying to find it, and I walked into the library, and the student working the library desk, when I asked them about it, they said, "We have a poetry center?" but I did find it, and it was the marvel that you describe it to be. Yes.
But, I mean, poetry always will struggle in some ways, I think, about it's how we recognize it, or how we, how we recognize its value to the culture. We, even at the U of A, struggle sometimes, and not everyone knows about the center or our work. So the discoverability of what we do is an ongoing thing we think about. I think my peers would say this too at other organizations. That said, that value is real, and when people experience what poetry makes possible, it's often there's no going back.
Well, and I would imagine being not, in the mass mainstream limelight offers some advantages as well as some difficulties.
It's true. I mean, poetry is an art that resists institutionalization, right? And we are an institution that presents poets. So we deal with that and think through that. And there's work we have to do to process all of that. But making space for the art form to thrive in the ways that it best thrives is that it exists in community, it exists within institutions, but often without it too. And so we recognize that and try to find ways to celebrate it.
How do you keep up with what's going on in poetry? I mean, even in the last couple of years, there are like major voices. I'm thinking of someone like Ocean Vuong, or someone who didn't exist in anybody's consciousness 3 or 4 years ago. And that's not the only one. How do you kind of keep your ears, eyes, reading glasses tuned?
So there's It's hard, and so we have other friends at the Poetry Center, colleagues there who are also responsible for this work of understanding the landscape and what's changing and what books are coming out that we should be most excited about or anticipate, and also trying to figure out what those are without being told what they should be.
Yeah.
So we rely on publishers to send us advanced copies. We sometimes are able to look through literary magazines and have a sense of books that are on the horizon that we're really excited about by seeing work in advance of its manuscript form. And we're trying to just listen. I mean, a lot of it is listening and being present and trying to watch as things shift. So.
Now, I direct a literary press and
Yes.
publisher of poetry. As someone on your place, do you have any advice for me?
I want to say thank you. I mean, you realize, the ecosystem around poetry, how poetry works beyond the writer writing in the room or at the desk. There are so many layers that are critical, and there's fragility there, and there's also creativity, there's opportunity. And so, what CHAX does, your press, Charles, so well is it thinks about how it exists in community. And in that space, poetry has always thrived.
Right.
And so not to say that we won't always scrap for grants and try to find resources.
I know
to
about
do our
that
work.
too. Yes.
But that's a space where I think where poetry is at its its most exciting.
Okay, we've got a couple minutes left. Could you
Sure.
say anything about maybe what's coming up in the near future for the Poetry Center, but maybe a word about what you see as like across the next few years?
Sure. So there's our reading and lecture series at the Poetry Center continues. We just collected in the fall our 50,000th book. So our work as a library has hit some exciting milestones. The reading series continues to move forward. We have a large grant that we're working on that will explore the language of incarceration and how poetry might also help us imagine that language in different ways. And this is language and legislation that has thought of groups of people in a particular way. We're asking poets to visit the language of legislation and to help repurpose that language to help reimagine the way we've thought of people. So that's a large part of the work. We'll be commissioning that work and bringing those poets to Tucson. More broadly for poetry, it's an exciting time.
Right.
I think it's an art form that is able, as I've said, to adapt and adopt differently than its peer and sister arts. And so that flexibility, and there's an inclusiveness to poetry also, that just other art forms I feel like aren't as able to modulate. And so for poetry, there's a real way in which I think there's a vanguard we are operating in, and I'm excited to continue to amplify and make space.
Excellent, excellent. I have a possibly weird question, but I'll tell you
I'm
my
ready.
answer first, which is
Please.
I've thought for a long time if I get a tattoo at some point, it's going to be the last 4 words of Christopher Smart's Song to David from the 18th century, which is determined, dared, and done. So if you had a line of poetry or a poem you would someday tattoo on your chest, shoulder, wherever, what might it be?
This is a good, a poem that when I worked at the Community College, I was commuting. I was trying to make that commute meaningful by memorizing poems. So Hopkins was the favorite one that I memorized. I caught this morning's minion would be my line.
How beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay. I think with that, I'm going to have to say that it's all the time we have for today. And I want to thank everyone out there for joining us on the Community of Writers. And thank you, Tyler, for joining me.
Thanks, Charles. Happy to be here.
Thanks.